Sega returns to a hunter-gatherer society as we bring 1984 to a close in Segaiden Episode 12. It's hard to believe, but we're already at the end of 1984. It's been a curiously slow year for the SG-1000, with a mere 11 games shipping for the base console in '84. That's only about half as many as shipped in 1983. This is not to say Sega was throwing in the towel in the system, however. On the contrary, nearly 3 times this many games would ship in 1985. The relative lack of activity from Sega's shipping department probably has a lot to do with all the activity happening behind the scenes. 1984 saw a massive upheaval and restructuring for the company as a handful of executives, including Sega founder David Rosen, arranged funding to buy the company back from Gulf and Western. Gulf and Western was an American conglomerate that had acquired Sega in 1969, and it began to divest itself of its properties as it entered a death spiral that led to its acquisition by Paramount at the end of the 80s. The passing of Gulf and Western's founder in 1983 appears to have innervated the media giant, and its dissolution began right around the time Sega shipped the SG-1000. At the same time that Gulf and Western suffered this blow, the American video games industry, in which the corporation was invested via Sega, also began its own seeming death spiral. It made sense for Sega, Gulf and Western's stake in an apparent failed industry, to be among the first properties to split off. As a result, Sega once again became wholly owned by its executives and began to enjoy more latitude to pursue its own ventures as its Japanese leaders saw fit. But the uncertainty and chaos that surround any corporate reorganization undoubtedly threw the proverbial spanner into the SG-1000's release schedule. The timing couldn't have been worse. It came right as Nintendo solidified its strategy for the family computer console, and as third-party publishers entered the market and made massive piles of money by catering to a growing and enthusiastic consumer base with little to no interference by Nintendo. This isn't to say Sega simply spent 1984 rolling over and dying, however. The SG-1000 has seen one crucial milestone this year in the form of the SG-1000 Model 2, a redesigned version of the system that addresses many of the original system's shortcomings. While it didn't add any horsepower or features to speak of, the Model 2 does bring the SG-1000 more in line with the next generation of home consoles, both in terms of looks and in functionality. With its clean lines and geometric detailing, it looks less like a toy-like holdover from the Atari 2600 generation and has more in common with the Western designs Nintendo would craft for the Famicom. Not just the NES, but even more so the never-released advanced video computer. The SG-1000 too also does away with the failure-prone joysticks in favor of Famicom-style gamepads, which could now be detached from the console. At the same time, the console moves the ribbon connector for the SK1100 keyboard to the front of the system, making a potential soft upgrade to SC3000 home computer status more elegant. The SG-1000 would also lend its look to 1985's Mark III, a genuine upgrade to the console. But for now, suffice it to say, Sega hadn't backed out of the home market despite its internal uncertainties. Hey, it's Compile. Remember them? They programmed home adaptations of 3 Sega VIC Dual System games for the console's launch, then promptly disappeared up until returning with Lode Runner. Well, here they are again, a year and change later, and unlike their uncredited work on Borderline, Safari Hunting, and Insub, their first original release, Hustle Chumy, bears their name loud and proud at all moments. I'm not entirely convinced this is necessarily the game to pin a reputation on, but it certainly feels less of a relic than that opening volley of titles. If Hustle Chumy has a single major flaw, it's that it plays entirely too much like a number of other games for SG-1000, 2 of which appear in this episode. And all 3 of these games revolve around a core gameplay loop that seems to come from Choplifter, which Sega licensed for arcades and will appear further down the line on SG-1000. The name of the game here is Hunt and Gather. Hustle Chumy, Flicky, and Girl's Garden all require the player to collect objects, a virtual task that the world had seen plenty of ever since Pac-Man hit it big in 1980. However, simple collection alone won't lead players to victory here. These games all require an additional step. You need to safely return to a designated location with those items in order to register a win. Again, this seemingly draws upon Dan Gorlin's Choplifter, which asked players to collect prisoners of war and fly them back to their home base. I'm sure you can point to some other example of this mechanic in a video game that predates Choplifter because there isn't a single idea in video games that someone thought of first, but Choplifter was definitely where this concept broke into the mainstream. Hustle Chumy asks nothing so noble of players as recovering political prisoners from a combat zone. Instead, you are a rat, Chumy, and you need to gather the food you find scattered throughout a sewer. Appetizing. Of course, it wouldn't be an action game if you didn't have to avoid a random throng of monsters that want you dead for no particular reason. This includes the obvious, a bat, what appears to be a cat, and an alligator, as well as less rational threats like a bipedal robot, I guess, and what is clearly a tiny Godzilla. Each of these enemies presents a distinct threat. Godzilla is indestructible and is the only monster that can traverse the lowest tier of the sewer, which is otherwise a sort of safety zone for Chumy. The cats and bats can be taken out in a single hit, but the cats have the ability to spring at you unexpectedly, while bats flutter around and like to hit you while you're climbing a ladder, and therefore defenseless. The robot thing takes several hits to destroy, and Godzilla is, in keeping with Toho canon, indestructible, since Chumy is armed with a small hand axe rather than an oxygen destroyer. Now the combination of mouse with collecting things within a maze, plus being chased by a small Godzilla, is likely to put you in mind of a previous SG-1000 release, unless you've sensibly erased it from your memory, Jaleco's Pop Flamer. In practice, the two games have massive differences, not least of which being that Pop Flamer is a janky piece of crap, while Hustle Chumy isn't. But even beyond that, they're pretty different. For one, Hustle Chumy is not a top-down maze game, but rather a side-view, ladders and platforms kind of game a la Donkey Kong or Burger Time, though the jumping action here is not for leaving pits, which don't exist in this game, and simply help you move forward in quick bursts. Also, Chumy doesn't have limits to his ammunition, leaving him free to chuck infinite hand axes, or whatever those are, at bad guys to his heart's content. And you'll find no weird potions that turn Chumy into a grotesque hellspawn the way you do in Pop Flamer. However, Hustle Chumy does incorporate one odd wrinkle into its gameplay. Wait. As Chumy gathers collectibles to take back to his lair, he evidently stores them in his belly, which bogs him down. The more stuff you accumulate, the more slowly Chumy moves. By the time you've collected everything in a stage, you're creeping along at a fraction of your normal speed, leaving you quite vulnerable to enemy attack. The further you advance into the game, the more stuff appears in the maze, while the time limits to complete each level grow ever shorter. Fortunately, Chumy can still make prodigious forward leaps no matter how bloated he happens to appear, though relying on jumps does introduce the risk of accidentally hopping into a monster. In the early stages, you have enough time to collect a few things and deposit them back to Chumy's home. By stage 4 or 5, however, the time limits become strict enough and the monsters aggressive enough that the only viable tactic is to simply gather up all the goodies on the screen from bottom to top and hop into the pipe that provides a one-way shortcut back to the lowest level of the sewer. In fact, this might be Hustle Chumy's real shortcoming. Every level plays more or less the same. You climb ladders while dodging foes, reach the top of the screen, then warp back down to the bottom, the end. The programmers did add a few quirks to provide a limited amount of variety, such as introducing moving manholes that randomly block ladders leading up from the bottom of the sewer, but really you're always moving forward and upward to reach the warp pipe. The action becomes faster and more hectic as you advance, but it doesn't fundamentally change, giving this one a fairly short shelf life. At least the main character is cute as a button. You'll also find hunting and gathering at the heart of Sega's next release, catalog number 1036, Flicky. Like Monaco GP, Flicky is one of the rare early Sega arcade games to have real lasting power. As a matter of fact, Flicky even showed up as a standalone Sega Genesis release, and it is, I believe, the oldest game to appear on the Sega Astro City mini console. The characters, both Flicky herself and the baby birds she seeks to rescue, have put in a ton of cameos through the years, in games as diverse as Shenmue, Sonic the Hedgehog, and Gunstar Superheroes. Like Hustle Chumy, Flicky takes the form of a platform action game that requires players to hunt, gather, and return objects to a home base. Where Flicky stands apart, well, it stands apart in several respects. For starters, this is a proper platform action game, which is to say that moving between different elevations of the screen involves jumping rather than climbing ladders. Not only that, but the jump action here feels quite a bit ahead of its time. You have a lot of control over protagonist Flicky and can even twist through the air to reverse her direction, which was pretty much unheard of in a 1984 video game. We generally look to Super Mario Bros. As the origin of truly excellent jump mechanics, but Flicky debuted in arcades nearly a year and a half before Super Mario. And up until that game shipped, Nintendo was still dealing in stiff, standard Mario Bros. Style jump physics. And to that point, it's worth mentioning that Flicky appeared on SG-1000 within a few months of its arcade debut. Sega clearly knew they had something great here and were quick to capitalize on it. The SG-1000 version of the game obviously doesn't look as nice as the coin-op rendition, but it's a convincing take on the original all the same. Admittedly, Flicky's design is fundamentally simple enough to work on SG-1000 without compromise. You control a bird, flutter between platforms, gather up lost chicks, avoid marauding cats, and attempt to lead the baby birds back to the starting point, which is helpfully labeled Flicky. In classic maze and platformer style, the cats are deadly to Flicky if they manage to catch her. They move around in a somewhat randomized but nevertheless consistent fashion, running mindlessly along a platform until they reach the edge, then pausing to reorient themselves based on Flicky's current location and either doubling back along the current platform or leaping to another that will lead them closer to their quarry. 2 cats appear on screen at a time, and they're fairly easy to avoid once you decrypt their patterns. In true Sega fashion, however, the gloves come off after a while, roughly stage 10 here, and the cats accelerate to the point of madness, at which point only Godspeed can save you. Unlike in Hustle Chumy, or in fact, most SG-1000 games, Flicky contains a lot of different stage layouts. These are perfectly manageable at the outset, mostly consisting of evenly spaced platforms at different heights, but after a while they become pretty tricky to navigate, with tiny gaps to pass through and awkward leaps to make. The levels loop in an endless scroll like Defender, and there's even at least one stage layout that plays up this design element by featuring what are essentially overlapping one-way passages. Thankfully, the game mechanics measure up to the task of dealing with these environmental hazards. Flicky maintains a fast, fluid pace throughout, with a heroine perfectly capable of outrunning and outleaping her foes. The relatively elaborate jump controls take a little getting used to. Flicky has a tendency to rebound off platform edges if she so much as brushes them, so you have to learn to make very precise jumps in order to avoid bouncing off what seems like it should be safe ground and into the mouth of a ravenous pursuer. Flicky doesn't enter the scene entirely helpless, however. In each level, you'll find random objects scattered about. Flicky can snag these and carry them briefly, flinging them forward once she leaps. Every object she touches, be it an ice cream cone or a handgun, glides along the ground smoothly and covers enough distance that it loops back into the screen from the opposite direction, and any cat it happens to smack into along the way will briefly ascend to Kitty Heaven before returning a few seconds later as a Kitty Revenant. The setup may remind NES Works viewers of a game that would show up on Nintendo's platform a year later in Japan, Jaleco's City Connection, and reasonably so. Both Jaleco and Sega were directly inspired by Namco's minor character action arcade hit Mappy, which saw a mouse leaping or bouncing around platforms in an effort to thwart a string of burglaries by a coterie of criminal cats. And what's the point of this harrowing effort? Flicky is no mere Pac-Man, gluttonously devouring all in sight, and she's no Clarice, vandalizing public roadways in a spree of miscellaneous terror. No, Flicky's quest is far more personal. She's rescuing her babies from a short and unhappy life as Kitty Chow. As you streak through the mazes, you need to gather up more than half a dozen tiny birdlings who have become lost and stranded, then lead them to the exit. As you make contact with your kids, the little ones follow along behind mom, as birds do. Once you return to the starting point of the level, all the birds you've collected will leap into the door and escape to safety, or rather to the danger of the subsequent level. The more chicks you gather at once, the more points you're awarded. A single chick is worth 100 points, but each subsequent bird is worth twice as much, with the last straggler from a full flock netting you a cool 5,000 points. Naturally, this is more easily said than done, as you still need to avoid all those cats. While the prowlers will kill Flicky on contact, they don't hurt the babies. They simply separate them from their mom, meaning you need to double back and collect them again should they fall afoul of the felines. It's a simple but enjoyable game thanks in large part to the straightforward objectives, the fairly crisp controls, and, somewhat unusually for Sega, a relaxed difficulty curve. There are even bonus stages every few levels in which you need to capture chicks that have been launched into the air in swirling formations, not unlike the challenging stages that were omitted from Sega Galaga. In other words, Flicky owes a lot to Namco, but if you're gonna swipe, why not swipe from the best? And last, but certainly not least in this week's trio of collectathons for SG-1000, we have perhaps the best known SG-1000 exclusive game of all time, Girl's Garden. Here you gather flowers to give to the world's most fickle boy in order to earn his affections. In what appears to be a first for Sega, you play as a human girl named Papri, who appears to have a hopeless crush on a real cat of a lad named Minto. Evidently, Papri and Minto are an item, or at least Papri would like for them to be, but Minto only has eyes for another girl. Minto's wandering heart is depicted somewhat literally here. In place of a stage timer, a small tableau at the top center of the screen imposes a strict deadline on Papri's efforts to keep her man from sowing his wild oats in a rival's garden. The meter at the top shows Minto slowly wandering from Papri's side to that of another woman, and if he strays all the way to the rival's arms, that's it for Papri's hopes and dreams. She can look forward to a love life that consists of nothing better than asking random weirdos to the Sadie Hawkins dance. And how, may you ask, does Papri solicit Minto's devotion? By bringing him flowers. Not just any flowers, though. Minto, demanding little weasel that he is, insists on nothing but the finest floral finds from the fields surrounding the small wooden structure in which he hides from the marauding bears that roam the countryside. It is thus Papri's task to pluck no less than 10 perfect blossoms and offer them as tribute to the flighty weirdo who has become the object of her affections. Along the way, poor Papri has to dodge all those roaming bears, which will go aggro at the mere sight of a small child collecting flowers and attempt to maul her for her efforts. The heart wants what it wants, Papri, but is a man as unreliable as Minto really worth being gutted and devoured by ravenous bears for, when he's just going to turn around and start an affair with some other girl once you reach the next stage? You have to assume Minto is some sort of flower addict, desperate for his next fix, but rightly terrified of bears, stringing along some poor girl to feed his addiction with the empty promise of a romantic commitment he's simply too fickle to stick to. Until at last, the girl ends up dead next to a stream somewhere. But at least Papri's not alone in her Sisyphean labors of love. Though Minto threatens to spurn her affections unless she risks life and limb for pretty trinkets, and the wandering bears see her as nothing more than a meaty morsel, a friendly bumblebee does what it can to ease the burden of her hellish existence. Every so often, the bee will zip across the screen to drop helpful items for Papri. These range from fruit, which is probably delicious and is worth many points, but doesn't really help Papri in her mission of man maintenance, to little stopwatches that have the power to freeze the bears in place. Sometimes the bee will even drop 1-ups, allowing Papri a sort of limited immortality by giving her another chance should she wind up dead in a creek or in a bear's belly. She's also not entirely helpless, as she's able to keep multiple entire pots of honey on her person to use as a lure with which to distract the bears. This isn't necessarily a get-out-of-bear-jail-free card, as an aggressive bear will still gut her if it passes her by before reaching the honey, but a well-placed honey pot will sucker in the beasts and give her a moment of freedom. However, there are greater dangers out there in the wilderness than mere hungry apex predators. Nothing in Girl's Garden is so deadly as that bane of all love-struck young women, dead flowers. While Papri needs to collect blossoms, flowers undergo a quick 5-stage life cycle. They bud, blossom, bloom, wilt, and finally die. Only a full bloom counts toward Minto's demands for romantic tribute, but where other floral forms mostly just count for nothing, collecting a fully dead bud will deduct 5 blossoms from Papri's collection, a tremendous setback. And so this is the gameplay loop, and I do mean loop since this wilderness exists in a perpetual endless torus like Flicky's platform spaces. Dodge bears, gather good flowers, avoid bad flowers, seek gifts from bees, and ultimately return to your petulant would-be lover with a gift of 10 flowers. The premise of Girl's Garden is goofy, yes, but most games of this era had wafer-thin pretexts, so it's all on par. At the same time, there's nothing in the design of this game to really merit such a long-lasting reputation, right? Yes, playing as a girl trying to win a boy's affection was pretty novel for 1984, where it usually worked the other way around, but still pretty much business as usual. Girl's Garden does some impressive things with the SG-1000 tech. The visuals here may not be as flashy as the giant boxers in Champion Boxing, but there's a lot happening on screen at any given time, with flowers bursting into bloom and rapidly dying away at random spots, all those bears and bees wandering around, and the world scrolling in a free loop in both directions, plus a variety of indicators above the action. This then is the true legacy of Girl's Garden. It's the Sega debut of the company's most revered programmer, Yuji Naka. Of course, Naka would go on to implement things like the gorgeous 3D mazes of Phantasy Star, and the venerated blast processing of Sonic the Hedgehog. You can really get a sense of Naka flexing in the bonus stages, which see you take control of a giant-sized Papri leaping massive bears. It's clunky, but seeing those enormous characters in action on SG-1000 is pretty impressive. Given Naka's stature and legacy, Girl's Garden has gone from being a whimsical little game chasing trends of the era to a sign of better things to come, which really is the SG-1000 in a nutshell. Neat, inessential, a little janky at times, but absolutely foundational to the future of Sega. And with that, SG-1000's journey through 1984 is complete. In fact, according to some of Girl's Garden's creators, the game actually shipped to retail in February 1985, despite official Sega documentation suggesting it shipped in 1984. 84 was slow for this platform, but things will change quickly in 1985 as the SG-1000 gets a shot in the arm with an upgrade and a new media format. nearly half the console's total releases will be clustered into the year ahead, easily eclipsing the 1983 and 84 lineups in quantity and quality. But we're not going to 85 just yet. Next time on Segaiden, we'll look at the SG-1000's shadowy other self.